thing we want to do is have a basic understanding of these scale insects that do damage. There are basically just two main groups that we should be concerned with as arborists. And why does it matter to identify those major groups? And we'll talk a little bit about that, why it's important. And then we'll also, of course, talk about how to manage them. And really what we're talking about is managing them or controlling them. And you notice I didn't say eliminate them because they're very difficult to eliminate. And then the photo in the lower left-hand corner is a beech bark scale, which is a fairly serious problem with beeches. And if you have any beeches, whether it be American beeches or copper beeches, these can be quite devastating. The scale, like I said, leads to cankers, which then leads to other secondary problems. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. One thing I just want to let you know is we have full-time tech support. It's not 24/7, but it's during the business day. And we have lots of problems, and we have lots of different management plans for all those problems. So knowing how to identify that scale is really half the battle. And so we can help you with all this. And so we suggest that you call our tech support man. His name is Eric Gabby. And Eric is a great guy. He's got a tremendous amount of knowledge at his fingertips. Many of my clients actually give his phone number to their plant healthcare managers. So if you're out in the field and you have a question, and you could possibly take a photo and send it to him to help identify a problem, that's what Eric is there for. He's a great guy, very knowledgeable, and he loves to help.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Webinars Made Easy.
Trees, shrubs, they suck them out of the stems, the leaves, and they also will take it out of fruit now and then. They feed, there's thousands of plant species that they feed upon, and really what they do is they devitalize the plants. And there are so many scales out there, it's just incredible all throughout the world. There's probably 8,000 different species, and by the end of this session, you're going to be able to identify each and every one of them. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So, but anyway, there's different types of scale out there, and they're distributed, like I said, worldwide. But here they are. You know, they're parasites. They're sucking plant juices. They seem to be important to ecosystems. But one thing about this particular variety, it produces honeydew. What that honeydew does is attract ants in great numbers. And then here's something. They have a symbiotic relationship with ants, this particular scale, because the ants, they've got a deal. The ants are coming in, they're saying, hey, we'll protect you from your predators if you provide us some food, which basically is the sugar. Another way of actually determining where the scale is located, as an arborist, you can actually just trace them and follow the ant trails up the tree, and oftentimes they will lead you to an infestation of scale, or let's say an aphid infestation as well. So their morphology is quite dense. They're fairly attractive looking in some ways. Some of them are somewhat camouflaged. Most homeowners have difficulty finding scales on their trees and shrubs, and it takes an arborist, oftentimes with a hand lens, to actually see the scales, because many times the scales will imitate lenticels on a twig. They'll also imitate a bud. So basically there's 48 families of scales, but we're really only interested in the soft scales, which is COCCIDAE, and then also the hard scales, which is DIASPIDAE. So it's kind of hard to say. I have trouble saying it, but basically you really want to know there's soft scales and hard scales, and the controls are different for each one of them. There's some similar controls, but there are some different controls for the hard scales. So basically, here's just a quick overview of soft scales, what they look like. They are generally tend to be a little bit larger and more convex. Some of them are not soft at all. They are actually quite crunchy, and you can squish them with your thumb. and they are more fleshier, let's say, than the armored scales. Again, they can be covered in wax, and they also produce honeydew, and we're going to learn why that is in a few seconds. The armored scales, of course, are flatter and harder, and they actually feed deeper into the tissue, and really what they do is they suck out, they don't feed on the sap, they suck out chlorophyll and plant parts. And so the difference between the two is one produces honeydew, the soft scales, and the hard scales produce no honeydew. So here's an example of where soft scales feed. So you've got your scale, it's in place. Now the feeding parts, or the stylets on a scale, in some cases can be 3 to 4 times longer in length than its entire body. So they have this long straw, like they're drinking soda out of a cup with a straw. So what they do is they penetrate through the cuticle of the leaf, through the upper epidermis, past the palisade cells, and they go right into the vascular bundle, and they're drinking the sap. They're taking the liquid, which generally is high in sugar, out of the vascular bundle. And so what they're doing then is, you notice these cells are starting to show some necrosis, and you're starting to see some dieback, but you're not really seeing any chlorosis. So what happens is they draw out large quantities of liquid, and it presents a waste disposal, and oftentimes you'll see a lot of the waste falling on plants below. You'll see sooty mold develop, and there's an example of some of the waste, some of the honeydew that basically attracts the ants as well. This will also provide a medium for a black sooty mold fungus that's growing on leaves on that particular plant. Now the other case, we've got the armored scales, and they do the similar feeding but in a different location. Again, they've got those stylets that go down, and they feed within the palisade cells and the spongy mesophyll, and they're feeding on the plant parts, and what they'll do is they'll create a necrotic or a little chlorotic region right where they're doing their feeding. Here's an example of euonymus scale. Now there's two types of euonymus scale. This one is a hard scale that feeds in the spongy mesophyll, and there's a winged euonymus scale that feeds only on winged euonymus. This particular scale feeds mainly on the Chiatrovicus or the Manhattan euonymus. But this is where they feed, right in this area. And one of the problems is that they're not picking up a lot of the normally used systemic insecticides. So again, looking at soft scales, they're not really that soft. Like I said, some of them are crunchy, and they're generally much easier to manage than the hard scales, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But one thing that they can do, and they can camouflage themselves. So some scales resemble twig buds. And here's an example of the spruce bud scale. You'll notice that this scale looks almost identical to a spruce bud. And if you're not trained to look for this, you will often overlook this. But what they are doing, they're devitalizing that branch or that twig, and then you'll start to see some tip decline. And if you're not a trained arborist, you may not even notice that particular scale right there. So these are some examples of some soft scales. The Magnolia scale is one of the largest scales. Produces a tremendous amount of honeydew. If anyone has ever come up to a magnolia that's infested, I hope you know what they can do. These scales, you can see, it seems like there's not enough room in there in the house. You can see the honeydew that's coming out. Basically what they do is they suck out the material, but there is some turgor pressure, there's some pressure from within the plant that pushes the sap out of the xylem. And you can see illustrated up there where that arrow is located. And it just makes a sticky mess, which definitely leads to sooty mold growing off that sugary base. Also, like I said earlier, that they are an important food source for other insects, and these insects will keep away a certain beetle away from the scale crawlers, so they have that symbiotic relationship, as I mentioned. So this is definitely a characteristic of the soft scales, and also that sugary substance will attract yellow jackets, and many times in my travels as a consulting arborist, I've gone to properties where the magnolias are located near a walkway, and the client calls because there's bees, there's yellow jackets attacking them as they go into the house. Well, that's very symptomatic of a magnolia scale, and here it is right here. It is the largest scale found in the U.S. with only one generation per year, and it creates a tremendous amount of honeydew. Another problem that you can see develop from magnolia scale is anything that's growing beneath a magnolia, whether it be shrubs or perennials, garden furniture, tables. Over the years, I've seen people complain more about the black sooty mold fungus than the actual infestation on the tree. So in order to control the sooty mold fungus on the property, you just control the scale on the tree. Very simple. Cottony scale, you don't see too much of it north of Washington, D.C., but it does exist. It's generally not that hardy north or further north than D.C. A lot of these scales can actually be quite colorful. Some of them are fairly dull looking, but LECANIUM scale, for example, is a fairly common scale on willow oak and pin oak down in the mid-Atlantic area. And I've seen twigs die back from this problem. All right, some of the hard scales, like I mentioned, they feed in a different location, and they are armored. And about a third of all the scales are in the hard scale family, and they're a little bit difficult to control, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. Some of these insects totally cover the stems, and they'll cover the leaves, mostly on the bottom, but I've seen some foliage that is actually covered in the top, on the top of the leaf. And so they're saying that this scale shell, this covering, has evolved over the year for protection, but it also protects them from chemical sprays. And one thing you have to be very careful of, a lot of times the homeowners will say, I've got this problem on my shrub, would you spray it right now? Well, that might make the homeowner feel better, but what really you're doing is a disservice, because oftentimes if you're not treating this hard scale with the proper insecticide at the proper time, you could be exacerbating the problem. And the reason I say that, if you're using a broad spectrum insecticide, like a bifenthrin product, and you're trying to get control at a time when the scale is not vulnerable, you will actually be killing off a lot of its natural enemies and predators. So you have to be really careful that you identify the scale and try to find out at what point in its life cycle is it vulnerable to pesticide treatments. And most of the time that is in the crawler stage. And here's, for example, oystershell scale. This scale has a very wide host range. It attacks 85 different species of plants. And it's very difficult, and that shell is quite hard. And they like I said, the populations build quite quickly. Another problem scale that we've seen mostly on cherry, you'll see it on lilac and privet and holly and euonymus, is the white prunicola scale. Has many generations. The control of white prunicola and white peach scale are basically the same. This is another scale that you're seeing more and more common. You're actually finding this in a lot of the nurseries out there that are producing nursery stock. And Japanese maple scale is very difficult to detect. The scales are quite minute. I did locate some down in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. this year. And one way to positively identify it is to go in there and lift the scale and take a look, take a small hand lens look in there, and you can see these really distinctly purple eggs, and that's one of the good indicators that you've got Japanese maple scale. Down below here we're talking about the control, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, is basically oil and distance. And if you're not familiar with distance, it's an insect growth regulator. One of the more difficult problems that hemlocks have, other than hemlock woolly adelgid, is the Fiorinia scale, or the Elongate hemlock scale. This is an imported scale. It's spreading rapidly, and it works quite quickly. And if you notice, if you take a look at the number of scales on some of those needles, you see maybe 4 or 5. But once you get up to 6 or 7 or 8 scales on that one needle, we'll basically devitalize that needle the needle will turn yellow, it'll turn brown, and then drop to the ground. And hemlocks have enough problems with hemlock woolly adelgid. They don't need any other problems. So when you've got a combination of HWA and the hemlock scale, you'll see a rapid declining hemlock. Now, what you can easily control hemlock woolly adelgid with a soil-applied treatment of imidacloprid, and that works quite well. However, it does not do much for the elongate scale because they're not feeding in the same area. Cottony cushion scale, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to see this much further north in DC. Here's an example of Dinotefuran, which is Safari or Transtech, versus the untreated control, which is in the red, on Fraser fir. As you can see, you've got, this is the untreated control, and we're talking about Dinotefuran, which is in the blue. That works quite well either as a foliar spray or a soil drench. And I would most recommend Dinotefuran as a soil drench because oftentimes the hemlocks are so tall, you get it's very difficult to get good coverage. But you can see where Dinotefuran works quite well and versus the control. White peach and white prunicola scale, if you've ever seen this on purple leaf plum or you've seen this on Quanzon cherry or any other cherry species, is very difficult to control. You've got to use the insect growth regulator, and we are doing some trials with Dinotefuran to get some control on this scale. This is a very damaging scale. You can obviously see this branch is quite heavily infested. Some plant health care operators will actually use the spray, the pressure off their spray gun, and they will basically sandblast that off, and that will do some help. You can also use water as well to physically remove it, but you've got to get on a routine treatment program with oil and distance. And here's a close-up of the white peach scale. The difference between white peach and prunicola really is identified by the crawlers. On the white peach scale, the crawlers, the female is salmon color, where the male is white. But when you go into the prunicola scale, both male and female are salmon color. So these give us our greatest challenge is controlling these armored scales. And you can see the damage that they do. They do suck out the chlorophyll and they create this chlorosis effect. So how do we manage these scales? Again, here's a review of the hard scales. Remember, they do not produce honeydew, and that's really helpful in identifying. All right, they don't produce honeydew because they're not feeding in the vascular bundle. They're feeding in the spongy mesophyll. And these are some fairly important scales to control, and these are probably within the area that you actually service. And again, the armored scales are hard to control. Softer scales are fairly easy to control. So what do we do? When do we treat, or how do we discern when to treat or not to treat? And we've got to look at some thresholds. And we really don't want to be spraying when you don't have enough plants out there to actually do damage. And a lot of them, like I said, are secondary pests, and some of them are nuisance pests. So if it's a light infestation, I would say probably do not do any treatments, because really what you want, you don't want to spray because you may kill off some natural predators. Here again, here's on Euonymus. This is the Euonymus scale, and you can see the kind of damage that it does. You've got to, if you've got a heavy infestation, you've got to get out there and do your treatments. And what can we, we want to eliminate the stunting effect that they have, of course, the chlorosis, and eventually the plants could die from it. Plus also have some cosmetic problems with sooty mold. So what do we do as far as management? What are some of the things we can do culturally? And that's the first step that you want to take. One thing I would suggest is that if you find a plant that's infested with scale and you haven't started treatments yet, I would hold off on using nitrogen. It has been, especially with hemlock woolly adelgid, they've done some trials where hemlocks that were infested with hemlock woolly adelgid were fed nitrogen, and you actually are nourishing that insect. So you can provide nitrogen, say if it's based, if it's recommended based upon a soil analysis, once you get the treatment under control. You can spray your plants. Actually, you can even spray them with forceful water, like I mentioned earlier. Horticultural oil, it's been used for many, many years, over 100 years actually, and it works on both scales. But one thing, this is a little bit of a commercial. Rainbow has a new sprayer that we're introducing that's going to save gas. And so this is new for this year. We have a horse-pulled sprayer that we're trying to promote in the industry that will be able to spray small trees. And this will be available in another couple of months. And of course, I'm just kidding. But this is how they did it back 100 years ago. They actually had horse-drawn sprayers, and the guys got up on that tower and they sprayed. Who knows what they were using at this point in time, but oil has been used for example, over 100 years. So what you want to do is spray your plants and make sure you get really good coverage. And the way oil works, it's not an insecticide per se. It doesn't paralyze the nerves. It doesn't paralyze their muscles. Basically what it does, it blocks the sphericals or their breathing tubes. And even low rates, even a half a gallon per 100 gallons of water will cause this insect to basically stop breathing. And what you want to do is you want to attack the crawlers, and that's the stage where they're most vulnerable. And when you think about it, the higher the respiration of that particular insect, the more easily it's going to be controlled when you cut off its air supply. If it's lying dormant, and a lot of the adults that are dormant underneath the shells, they're not going to get control because their respiration rates are low to begin with, and they've got the protective covering. Another product that we recommend using is Distance, and this is an insect growth regulator. It's used on the crawlers. It will not control the adults. It's basically used on the developmental young. And you use this in combination with oil at the time when the crawlers start to emerge, and that depends on the particular scale. One thing that Distance does, it inhibits the growth and the development of these eggs and nymphs. And like I mentioned, it does not control the adults. And you can use it with even a very low rate in the summer. Let's say you're applying this on peat scale, and you may be doing that, let's say in June or July, and you can go with a low rate of oil. And it has this translaminar activity, and basically what that is if it's applied to the surface of the leaf, the pesticide will be distributed to the lower side of the leaf, often where most scales are doing their feeding. So that is a really nice feature of Distance. You'll get fairly good coverage even though the applicator doesn't get the top and the bottom of the leaf. And it can be used at fairly low rates. I would recommend 8 ounces per 100 gallons of water, but the label says that you can actually apply up to 12 ounces per 100. And always please remember, whenever you're doing spraying, in this case you don't need it because you're using oil, but if you're doing foliar sprays, always use a non-ionic spreader sticker. That's going to give you more bang for your buck. So many people I've run into over the years think that it's built into the pesticide, which it's not. You have to add it. It costs you pennies, and it's just makes your application more effective, and you get better coverage. And so I'll get off my soapbox. And then again with Distance, no more than twice in the growing season. Okay, so here's what we do. Spraying, there's always going to be a need for spraying. It's been around for many, many years, of course, but what you're finding out, due to a lot of the local regulations, it's becoming more and more difficult to spray your client's tree without getting any chemical trespass onto the neighbors. So, but spraying also gives you other challenges as well as far as timing. Most of these insects, and all insects basically, their life stage is monitored by growing degree days. So the timing can be an issue. So you can't go by the calendar. you've got to go by the growing degree days and also in combination with phenology, which is the growing degree days combined with a different plant or a pest activity that's going on out on the landscape. You've got to get complete coverage, and sometimes that can be challenging as well. We mentioned about notification issues, the drift issue. What do you do if you've got a large tree that's got a scale infestation that's on the borderline, and the neighbor to your left has an organic garden directly below it or nearby? So these are some of the challenges that we have. Also with temperature considerations too. You really should not apply a spray, especially an oil spray, when the overnight temperature is going to go below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the same time, you really should not apply it if it's going to be hotter than 85 degrees that particular day as well. So these are some challenges that we have. But one thing that we take at Rainbow is sort of a toolbox approach. There are lots of different ways to skin a cat, as they say. With the soft scales and in some hard scales, soil application can be made with imidacloprid, which is known as Merit or Zytec. And this can be applied both, as you see, either by injection or with a drench. And the product is identical, the rates are the same, but really what you've got operationally is the injection for this guy on the left with the backpack unit and the HTI injector. He does not have to pull back the turf. He does not have to pull back the mulch or the soil to make this application. He can just go within 1 to 2 foot distance of the tree. We're only going in about 4 to 6 inches below the soil line because that's where all the important roots are located for uptake. So operationally, you can get, if you've got a lot of trees to do, I would go with the soil injection method. If you've got 1 or 2 trees to do, you can pull back the mulch, pull back the turf. You can mix up the imidacloprid in a 5-gallon spackle bucket from Home Depot and make your application. Obviously, this makes it looks more professional in the eyes of the client on the left, where the client sees this on the right and they'll say, gee, I could have done that. So imidacloprid is very effective for soft scales. And then here's another product that you can also use for soft or for hard scales is Dinotefuran, which is known as Safari or Transtec. And one of the differences is that they are both a neonicotinoid product, but Safari or Transtec is 80 times more water soluble than imidacloprid. And what does that mean? It moves more rapidly up into the tree. It gets up there very, very quickly. And so, but on the other side is that the Dinotefuran runs out of gas in about 5 to 7 months. So what you've got to do, you've got to make your application timing it so that you get peak amounts of the insecticide up in the tree when you need it the most. You don't want the product to be running out of efficacy, where imidacloprid takes a lot longer to get up into the tree, but it has a longer residual. So we'll talk a little bit about this in a second or two. Here's Transtec, which is Dinotefuran. And you can see over here on the far right, this is the untreated control. And this is measured in number of scales per plant. And you can see where Transtec at the high rate did fairly well, but even at the low rate, for some strange reason, it did better. Safari, again, Safari and Transtec are identical products. Zytec, again, here is the high rate, did a little bit better than the low rate. So you can see this works quite well for soft scale with soil injection. And here's an example as how more systemic Transtec is over Zytec. And you can see Zytec here in the yellow. This is in nanograms of active ingredient per gram of leaf tissue. And you can see in 7 days, Zytec is just starting to be taken up in the tree, where you can see in 7 days the Transtec is already up in the tree. 30 days, it's up there. It looks like it's actually peaked. And 60 days, you can start to see the levels drop with Transtec. But with imidacloprid, you can just see the active ingredient is still building. So that is the difference between the two. Both are super systemic, whether they're applied to the soil or in the case of Transtec can be applied to the soil, or it can be also applied as a bark spray. You can actually spray Transtec on the lower 5 foot of the trunk of the tree, and I have a client that's doing a project right now on Hemlock woolly adelgid and Hemlock elongate scale, and he is spraying, I don't know how many trees, maybe a couple of hundred hemlocks with a bark spray using Transtec. You're not really worried about drift, you're low pressure, and you're going to get really good uptake. Here's an example of comparing 3 different spray treatments compared to one treatment of soil-applied Dinotefuran for pine needle scale. As long as your timing is correct, you're going to get good control on all of them. But what does Dinotefuran do? It frees you up. It allows you to make that application a little bit earlier than necessary and not hold you to your feet to the fire with insecticidal soaps and a lot of these other foliar treatments. You have to do it exactly when the crawlers have emerged. What the Dinotefuran does, it frees you up to make other sales calls, to get new clients, and also to give better service to your existing clients that say need a more important treatment, like for Japanese beetles or for scab disease. So this basically buys you some time. So it moves into the tree very quickly, and it also distributes very quickly throughout the plant through the root applications. And you can see here some before and after treatments. Again, you want them to scale. This is, again, as a hard scale, and this is the time period where you want to make that application, because that's when the crawlers, well, this is when you want the active ingredient up in the tree, is when the crawlers are present. Again, in this case, you're recommending 1% hort oil and distance for the crawlers. And the Transtec, you can do that as a soil app, probably like in April or somewhere, because it takes very little time to get that into the tree. European elm scale, a little bit broader period of time where you can actually get some good control. You can apply Zytec either in the spring or the fall, and it will, even if you applied Zytec in the fall before, you will still get very, very good control. If you apply this, let's say in March, it takes anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks for uptake of Zytec, where Transtec goes up very, very quickly. So here are the basics. Where you have identified your scale as a soft scale, you've got the option to spray oil alone. You can do that in the early spring, but you're going to get the most bang for your buck with hort oil and distance when the crawlers start to emerge. Your soil application could be either imidacloprid, Zytec, or Transtec, Dinotefuran. Where your hard scales, you're really only limited to hort oil and distance. Oil alone does not work very well on a hard scale. And then you've got your soil applied Transtec that will work on most hard scales. Some people have asked me about what are the effects that of the cold temperatures have had on some of the insects this year. And this is data courtesy of Stanton Gill down at the University of Maryland. And he's done some studies, and recently, this is just recently published a couple of days ago, that he finds that India wax scale down in Columbia, Maryland, he took samples on this one particular plant at 3 different levels, high in the plant, at the middle of the plant, and low branches, and all the India wax scale were dead except for the lower levels, and very possibly because the temperature's a little bit moderated there. Possibly they could have been protected by some snow. So this is a benefit from the cold weather that we've been having this year. And similarly, there's been a lot of inquiries about what has the cold temperatures this year done to emerald ash borer. And actually, they've done some tests on EAB larvae, and they've actually brought them down to 20 to 30 below degrees. And what happens is they produce some sort of like a glycol, very similar to antifreeze, and that enables their bodies to be totally frozen. So they have some of these protective substances within their bodies that they manufacture that protects them from very cold temperatures. So what they concluded is that they're seeing that we might get some mortality with emerald ash borer, but it's not going to be what they were hoping for with the 0%, with 100% kill. So again, you know, if you have any questions, you've got to call tech support. Eric Gabby is a great guy. He will help you with your scale questions, but he's got a lot of protocols on a lot of insect and disease problems that that you'll encounter. And so don't be afraid to ask him, talk to him, email him, text him, and he'll be able to help you out. So again, we've got these protocols available for you. And again, don't forget to enter your name and your ISA number in the message box below. And I just again want to thank you for your time, for spending your time learning a little bit about scales. And please look forward to some of the other webinars that will be coming up in the near future. And I hope all is well, and hope you have a good spring, and hope your business goes well. Thank you very much.